The objective of this video is to describe the behavior of a rational function near its asymptotes. And I'm using the examples from the previous video and going through those to explain the behavior of the function near the asymptotes. So I've already have these functions listed as well as what we found to be the vertical and horizontal asymptotes. So we're going to use the calculator kind of in conjunction with what we stated as the definition of a vertical and horizontal asymptote. So if you recall, a vertical asymptote was defined to be x equals a as long as the function went to positive or negative infinity as we approached the value of a. The horizontal asymptote is y equals b as long as when we go to positive or negative infinity for the x values, the function is approaching that value at the horizontal asymptote. So with that said, what we want to find out is this. For the vertical asymptote, we want to find out what's happening as x goes to 5. We actually have to talk about it from the right, and what's happening as x goes to 5 from the left. In other words, what's happening to y there. And we also want to find out what's happening as x goes to positive or negative infinity. What is y approaching? Okay? Now, these should be infinity or negative infinity, and the last one should be y is approaching 0. So let's just confirm that. So I've entered actually all three functions in the calculator, though the first one is the only one that's turned on because the equals is highlighted. To turn them off, you can cursor over the equal sign and press enter, and that removes the highlighting from that equal sign. So let's begin by looking at the graph. So this is one of those basic horizontal or basic rational functions just shifted to the right by 5. This vertical line really is not part of the graph. It should be a dotted line. The way that the calculator does it, it actually connects the pixels together, and so that's why it gets that line. You could do it in dot mode, and it would give you a graph that would not be connected there. But the key thing is we can kind of see as we're going from 5 from the right and 5 from the left, the graph is going off to positive or negative infinity. But I want to confirm that even further. As we look at the table, what I want us to do is kind of zero in on what's happening at the 5. Oops, I went in the wrong direction. Sorry about that. We see we have an error message, and we only have integer values here, 4, 5, and 6, but no, there's infinitely many numbers between 4 and 5. And so what we're going to do is refine our calculator. We're going to start the table at 4, and now we're going to increment it by like 0.1. Let's just see what's happening. So as you can see, between 4 and 5, if we increment by 0.1, we're getting to values that are like negative 30. Well, let's go even further. Let's start at 4.9, and instead of counting by 1/10, let's count by 1/100th. So if we do 0.01, what you see now, we're counting by 1/100ths, and as we get closer and closer to 5, what's happening? Yes, the y values are getting more and more negative. So as we're coming into 5 from the left side, y is approaching negative infinity. Well, we can see that same result on the other side. Now as we're looking at 5.01, 5.02. So as we're going closer and closer to the let me just think about it like this, as we're going closer and closer to 5, so come in from the bottom up, really closer and closer to 5, my y values are getting larger and larger and larger. So y is approaching positive infinity there. Now we've got to examine what's happening at the extreme values of x, that is the long-term behavior. So let me change this. I'm going to go back to, oops, I didn't mean to do window, I meant to do second window. Let's change that to 5 and just change it by 1 for a minute. That's what we were doing. Now you can certainly scroll down and see that my values are doing what? As I get larger and larger, my y values are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So let's do this. Let's have our table start at 100, and now let's have a change in table of 100. And you can see as I'm getting larger and larger and larger, my y values are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and they're getting closer and closer to 0, which is what my horizontal asymptote should be. Well, that's also true in the negative direction. As I get more and more negative, my y values are also getting closer and closer to 0. So those things confirm my horizontal and vertical asymptotes that we found. Well, let's look at now the second function. So if we press enter to turn the first one off, I'm going to hover over the second equal sign and press enter to turn that one on, and go to the standard window. So we see that again we have this vertical asymptote at 0, and it looks like we have a horizontal asymptote at 4, but we can confirm that. So we need to think about what's happening as x goes to 0 from the right, what's happening as x goes to 0 from the left, and what's happening as x goes to positive or negative infinity. Well, let's look at the table. And since I've already got it set up to count by 100s, let's consider this last case first. So as x goes to plus or minus infinity. So what's happening as I get more and more negative? What are the y values doing? Yeah, they're getting closer and closer to 4, right? 3.9997. If I go in the other direction towards positive infinity, my y values are coming in on the value of 4. So the long-term behavior is that at positive or negative infinity, the y values of this function are approaching 4. Okay? Now in this case they're not equal to 4. You actually can cross a horizontal asymptote. We're going to get into that in the next section, but for right now we just need to know that we're approaching 4 as we go to that extreme value. Now let's zero in on what's happening close to the 0. That is a vertical asymptote. So let's change our window or our table setup. This time we want to start at 0, and we're going to change by like 0.01. Okay, and then we'll move in either direction. So as we go from the right hand side of 0, so coming into 0 from the right hand side like 0.06, 0.05, 0.04 and so on, notice that our y values are getting larger and larger and larger. So that would indicate that we're going off to positive infinity. On the other side of 0, our y values are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, which is getting closer to negative infinity. We can fine-tune that one more time. Let's count by 0.001, and you can see it a little bit better. The y values are getting larger and larger and larger on the right side of 0. They're getting smaller and smaller and smaller on the left side of 0. So as x is approaching 0 from the right, y is going to infinity, and as it's approaching 0 from the left, y is going to negative infinity. And we can see that graphically, right? Because on the right side of 0, the graph extends upward indefinitely, but on the left side of 0 is extending downward indefinitely. And our last case here, let me turn off this middle equation and turn on our last equation, and we can graph that. Okay, the graph again may not mean too much to us here, but our vertical asymptote is 1, which is confirmed by that line. It looks like it's a part of the graph, but again it really isn't. And notice that it doesn't look to have like there's a horizontal asymptote at the extreme ends, right? It's not going into some constant line. So we can look at that. What we need to do, let's find our behavior near the asymptotes first, since I already have the table set up to count by thousandths. So as x goes to 1 from the right and 1 from the left. So let me change my table setup to start at 1. and we'll count by 0.001. So we can see, right, as x is going closer and closer to 1 from the right, our y values are getting larger and larger and larger. As we're getting closer and closer to 1 from the left, we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So that does confirm that we have a vertical asymptote here. Now what's happening as x is going to plus or minus infinity? What is y approaching? Well, let me change my table setup. So this time we will start at 100, and let's change by 100 or 1000, whatever you want to do, just to see what's happening as you get larger and larger and larger. Well, look at that. It's not coming in on any particular number. In fact, as we get larger and larger and larger in the x direction, in the positive x direction, our y values are getting larger and larger and larger. And is that the same thing that's happening in the other direction? Yeah, in fact, they're going off to infinity. So as x is approaching positive and negative infinity, there is no value for y. So we have no horizontal asymptote. And so that is confirmed there. Okay, because as x is going to plus or minus infinity, I guess I should say this y is going to infinity. So there's no horizontal asymptote. Okay, so if you have any questions on how to describe the behavior near the asymptote, please contact me. Thanks.